Good evening and welcome. My name is Tomas Kenny and I'm a member of the Diocesan Pastoral Team. The purpose of this evening's webinar is to offer liturgy resources and suggestions to parishes as restrictions are lifted and parish life can regain all aspects of celebration and ministry. The outline for this evening is we'll begin with a short welcome and prayer. Then my colleague Francis Rowland will present on the theme Together Again. Francis will be followed by Father Padraig Walsh, parish priest of St. Brendan's in Tralee, and Padraig will present resources on Remembering in November. Today is the feast of Our Lady of the Rosary. So now we'll take a moment to reflect as we pray to Mary. O Mary, the first of the apostles, you were attentive to the message of an angel. You pondered God's word and responded with openness. Help us to notice God's action in our lives. Teach us to ponder the Spirit's invitation and respond as you did, saying, "May your will be done in me. Amen." At any stage during this evening's webinar, if you wish to ask a question, there's a caption at the bottom of your screen entitled Q&A, questions and answers, and just insert your question and we'll get to it throughout the webinar this evening. So now we'll hand you over to Francis Rowland, who'll take you through the first part of tonight's celebration and presentation.
Thanks, Tomas, appreciate that. And welcome to everybody. Isn't it fantastic to be back together again, contemplating, organizing, energetic and energizing, and just chance to be together really as a faith community. So I'm conscious that the last 18 months have been a challenge in different ways for different people. And really, I suppose what we're at tonight is reflecting a little bit on that transition out of the stage we've been in. We're like the butterfly coming out of the pupa. We're the emerging flowers. And while the pandemic has been difficult and people have experienced maybe great loneliness, maybe sadness, maybe loss and death and illness, there has been also that experience of being asked to stay away from one another, to remain apart, to stand back in a way that is maybe not natural to us. And in that transition from that experience into where we are now, maybe there's a little bit of trepidation. Maybe we've got used to the restrictions that we have been living with over the last year and a half. And maybe we feel a little bit apprehensive, a little bit unsure about coming out again. Our faith teaches us that where two or three are gathered together, Christ is there among us. So over the past while, our domestic churches, our families have been places of prayer. That's where we have maybe attended Mass most comfortably, nervous perhaps of going back to the church. But gradually we've been coming back into our own churches, and whether we've come to daily Mass or whether we've come to the weekend Mass, we're beginning to move out of the restrictions and the confinement and stretch out towards community again. We're made for community. Our Sunday Mass is about the community gathering to pray and worship together. It's about listening to the word of God together. It's about hearing what it might mean for us in this part of the world. It's about coming together to gather all the joys and the sorrows of the week that has been, to offer them to God, to receive the body of Christ, to become the body of Christ, and then to go out with a lift in our hearts, a leap in our steps, and joy for the week ahead. And hence, the poster you see there in front of us, Together Again. Through the Diocesan Pastoral Council and the area pastoral councils, the idea came together that it would be great to kind of launch ourselves back into this new season, this new way of being. And so we felt that there was a time between now really and Christmas when we might start that beginning to be together again. This time is about reconnecting. It's about gathering ourselves after the last 18 months. It's about renewing our lives. It's about catching up. Lots has happened over the last 18 months. And when we haven't met one another in the ways that we normally would at Sunday Mass or outside the church or wandering around, we've lost out on bits of news. And it's about revitalizing all that makes us parish. So as you see there, we're suggesting that 10 days after the final restrictions we hope are lifted on October the 22nd, that we might begin that Sunday to launch forward and to gather all the parts of our parishes together again. So it gives us about 10 days. And really, what are we talking about here? We're talking about beginning to make our move forward. So as we go through this evening's presentation, I'll be suggesting to you to listen to what makes sense for you, listen to the possibilities and the suggestions. Some might work for you, some will work for others. Perhaps you yourself have suggestions that you think would be helpful. So Tomas mentioned to you the Q&A button, so you might drop any suggestion or any question you have in there for us. Partly why we think it would be good to start in this last weekend of October is it's before we move into that November space. And Padraig will speak a little bit more about November in a moment. So it's about gathering in this October space as we and onwards, that sense of who we are as parish again. So I'm going to concentrate on 4 different aspects, and maybe these might be helpful to you at home. The first one I'd be asking you to look at would be invitation. Now, I don't know about you, but it's for me, when I get an invitation, and God, we've had very few of them over the last year and a half, there's a sense of joy, there's a sense of expectation. And I think we, as a community, need to extend that sense of invitation to others. Maybe some among our parishioners have been slow to come back to the church, physically just a little bit nervous. So perhaps in our newsletters, we might let people know that parish life is resuming and that all the precautions are being taken. We might use our social media to let people know the times of masses and that actually now that restrictions are lifting, people can gather in greater numbers in our churches. I know I was at Mass somewhere recently and the priest in all fairness said, maybe some people could try coming during the week because we're a little bit packed here on a Sunday. But now, 2 months on, we can be a bit more packed on a Sunday. So we're moving from the 50 people in the pods to the 50%, and please God, to full complement. You might use your parish newsletter, your social media, you might use your own voice, invite people you know, and be gentle with people who might feel that a little bit more anxious. And then we have a poster. You saw it there on the last slide. That poster is available for all the parishes of the diocese. It's in English on one side, Trí Gaeilge on the other side, Le Chéile Arís, and put that up in your porches. Put that up anywhere that will invite people to gather again as a parish community. And in the morning, I'll send you all a JPEG. So if you want to get it printed and put outside your churches, that would be a great idea too. Because sometimes we wait until people get into our church to say that there's something happening. So I'd be inviting you this time, let's get the message out there. The invitation has to go far and wide. The next thing I'd love you to look at would be the environment, the atmosphere into which we come. Over the summer, perhaps like you, when I've been in any part of the diocese or up and down the country, I've been visiting any church I could go into. And what's lovely is each one has a different atmosphere, depending on their location, depending on the community around them. And they say something, it's like a personality. So I'd be asking you to think about what's the personality that's coming out in the atmosphere in your church. One of the things that COVID has brought us has been the gift of ushers. And I don't know about you, but I have loved coming to Mass and being greeted by an usher. There's something human about it. There's something friendly. to be just welcomed. Sometimes it's somebody I know quite well because I'm living in a large town. Sometimes it's somebody I don't know. But over the time of COVID, I've got to know them because I'm smiling at them Sunday after Sunday or during the week as well. So it's been a real gift and a real sense of welcome. So perhaps that's something that we could ask our ushers maybe now to really extend that hand of welcome. They don't have to put out their hands, but just that smile, that encouragement, and perhaps indicating to us the seats or the newsletters, etc. During the last 18 months, one of the things that has struck me is the creativity we have as people. So people have been painting, they've been cooking, they've been writing poetry, they've been doing blogs, they've been taking photographs, they've been enjoying nature. Young people, children might be very good at this, but also older people. So I'd be inviting you to invite all of those in your parish, those in the schools and those who are living all around you, adults and children, that they might like to bring in a poster or a poem or a piece of art that reflects together again. And that we might put those up in our church so that as we come back, there's a sense of, oh, people are here before us. The welcome is already here. As we come into our churches, one of the things that often strikes me is that our entrance hallways and our porches can look a little bit dead. I know we're often running in from the rain, like we might be if we were out tonight, a damp evening that it is. But maybe just to spend a little bit of time on, does it feel welcoming? Are there things that we can remove from this space? Maybe just look at the lighting. We're very conscious now that plants are very important in terms of cleaning the air. So perhaps there is a space for plants in your porch. Look at your notice boards. Could they do with a little bit of a G up? We haven't had a lot going on in the last year and a half. Maybe some of the notices are a little bit old. You know, it could be as simple as putting the new poster up on the notice board, or putting a coloured cloth or a coloured page behind the notices you have, and just give us all a little bit of a G up. I know it's not springtime, but maybe we need a little spring clean and a springing up as we come back into our churches. Lots of you in liturgy groups are really good at what we call sacred spaces or focal spaces. That's really what I'd like to call them, focal spaces. Because our churches are beautiful and all of it is sacred, but there is a help in having a focal space for a season. It kind of helps to focus our minds and maybe just reveal some particular aspect of our faith or our church thinking that we're trying to emphasize. So in the resource that I'll send out to parishes tomorrow and to all of you who were here on the Zoom webinar, we're suggesting that you create a journey. Really, we've been on a journey for the last 18 months, haven't we? So some of the things you might put on that path or that roadway might be things that are very familiar to us, the face mask or the sanitizer. You might put maybe an image of a phone or a laptop or a tablet. God knows, we have been so blessed to have this form of getting together and chatting with one another. There might be something of having a nod to the worries that have been there. So it might be a box of stones or a basket of stones. And on the stones, you could write words like sickness, ill health, anxiety, fear. These have been part of our lives. But then to counteract them, let's be conscious of all the gifts that people encountered, the kindness of people, the goodness, the stretching out of a hand, metaphorically speaking at least, and nature. And here in the Diocese of Kerry, we're so blessed to have so much of nature around us that really has heartened us and given us a sense of God's goodness and kindness over the last 18 months. So there might be symbols of nature there. And finally, a candle. All along this journey, Christ has been with us. Christ has walked with us. And each of us, in our own little way, has held our own flickering candle of faith to keep going. So that might be the third or the fifth piece you put there in that image. And we'll come back to how you might use that sacred space later on. Just in terms of still staying with the environment and your focal space, perhaps on the last while, we've been really conscious about keeping people safe, and that will continue. So just to make sure that all that helps us to stay safe in terms of ventilation, in terms of sanitization, is still there. The atmosphere is built up by our musicians and our music. So gradually, and I know Tomas had a webinar earlier on this week with choir people, gradually the choirs are building up. So let's choose joyful music as we move on, things that give us a lift and give us a sense of community together. I've mentioned that you could have plants in the hallway. Flowers around our church will also work. And again, they give us a sense of the beauty of God's creation and the beauty with which God surrounds us. And then finally, I'd be talking to you a little bit about processions. Processions are a great way of involving people. You can have processions at different times of the liturgy. You can have processions right at the beginning. And if you are having a procession at the beginning, maybe it's an idea to invite people to sit down as people process through, just so you can see what it is that is being carried in the procession. So involvement, you might be saying, oh gosh, sure, we can't involve people, but you can. All through COVID, fair play, we have had ministers of the Eucharist who've been really careful about their sanitization and about keeping us all safe. We've had ministers of the word, and now we've also had musicians, mostly just maybe a cantor and one musician. But gradually you can grow that number. So let's have people bringing forward the bread and wine. Let's have our two ministers of the word back again, reading the first and second reading and the prayer of the faithful. And let's have all of our Eucharistic ministers back, as we will need them to be as our community grows. Over the last while, people have celebrated really special moments. Let's involve those people, even though we weren't there at those special moments. So we've had baptisms, we've had first communions, confessions, we have had confirmations, and we've had weddings. How will we involve that group of people so that we celebrate those special moments in their lives over the last 18 months? So in the pack that we will send out to you tomorrow, there's a resource about involving that group and marking those special occasions, because really those occasions are marks of faith for us, are marks of hope for our community and a sense of joy. Let's make sure that we gather in that joy as we move forward. I mentioned that we will be moving in to the season of November, and that will be a time when we'll pray very specially for the dead, but we'll also remember to gather in those who have been bereaved over the last year and a half. Just one last group that we might be conscious of involving is our young people. Just for the moment, we're not quite ready to move back with the altar service, but there are other ways of gathering young people. So it might be in the procession at the end of Mass that you might invite the young people who received their first Holy Communion over the last 2 years. They might like to walk out in front of the priest. Now, if you're in a very small church, that's very possible. If you're in one of our larger parishes, that might be something you might have to think about a little bit more carefully. And you might have to say, look, we might have a few people representing all of them. Okay, the next bit we want to look at is the liturgy. So let me look at my notes here. In the packs that you'll receive tomorrow, one of the first things we wanted you to think about were bells. Bells indicate a sense of joy, a sense of hope, and a sense of delight. I've been really conscious, because they were quiet for quite a while, of hearing the bells when there's a wedding on here in the cathedral. So we're asking you, on the Sunday that you celebrate together again, Sunday, October the 31st, or another one, let the bells ring. Let the bells ring before Mass starts, and let the bells ring as the procession makes its way up to the sanctuary. Let's hear the joy and the delight of the bells. And as the Mass is ended and we go out to proclaim God's goodness, let the bells ring again, loud and clear. We've given you a welcome prayer, trying to find a way of welcome back all the different cohorts and the different experiences people might have had over the last 18 months. It's not written in stone. Omit the bits that you don't want. Add bits that make sense for your parish. Make it your own and make it a welcome prayer that works in your local church. We've given you homily notes, maybe just that might help you to reflect on the flavour and the feel of this day. We're inviting you that instead of saying the creed, we might have our baptismal promises. We have missed 2 Easters, so wouldn't it be great to stand as a community and to profess our faith in this way? But instead of the sprinkling where the holy water is sprinkled on us and down through the church, we're suggesting that remains in the sanctuary for the moment, just in case of anything. There's prayer of the faithful there. Wouldn't it be lovely to involve different speakers so that we hear the prayer of the faithful through different voices? Presentation of the gifts. Since we have had a sprinkling with holy water, but it hasn't landed on us, the people, wouldn't it be lovely to have holy water bottles to go? There's a blessing, a special blessing at the end of Mass. And then as we leave, wouldn't it be lovely to have some way of gathering? Some of you are lucky enough to have a pastoral centre or a parish centre right beside your church. If the weather is good, couldn't we have a cup of tea or a bun or something that says we're a community, we're together again? You'll know what will work best in your place. And maybe you're already thinking of things and you might stick them in the Q&A to us. But hospitality would be just a lovely flavour. And just for those of you who are thinking practically, closer to the time, we will send out guidelines when we actually have the guidelines from the COVID committee here in the diocese and also from government. But just for yourselves, just to know, we imagine water fonts will stay empty. Sanitizers need to stay in place. So if you have a sacred space, if you have a lot of readers, let's have sanitizers available everywhere. We can never use it too much. We will continue to social distance, maybe in a more internal way than externally. So maybe some of our props will have disappeared from our churches, but we have grown used to being careful ourselves of standing back and giving people space. We will continue to have ushers who remind us of how best to move in our space and how to move forward for communion, etc. That's a real gift. The sign of peace will remain a gesture of the nod of the head or the wave or the looking around or the smile if we're not wearing masks. That will be important. Communion we will continue to receive on the hand. Our choirs will gradually build up and give us more energy. And finally, the collection baskets for the moment will stay at the front of the church, or sorry, at the back of the church. Okay, there's lots to get you going. Padraig, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Francis, and thank you for that very upbeat presentation. And it certainly gives us a great sense of reopening with a sense of joy and upbeat, which I think we're all looking forward to as well. For myself, I'm going a small bit beyond that and looking to the celebration of November. Very different in its mood, and I suppose for liturgy groups, November is something probably that we're best at because it's familiar, maybe over familiar, and maybe we need to rethink it again because we missed out November last year. November, I suppose, is a very unique month, a month that is dedicated to remembering our dead. A month is a long time. We have a day for St. Patrick, a day for Daffodil Day, but we have a whole month to remember and pray for our dead. It's interesting that people who mightn't be very religious or maybe admit to not being religious at all sometimes observe November. It might be a special mass for those who have died. It might be giving up the drink for the month of November. So it's a very interesting thing that's in our Irish psyche. We're also mindful for people that it's a difficult month. The nights are long, the clocks have already gone back. So it kind of has that mood of darkness and gloom for some people. The November list is very much part of our tradition. And I think there's a great therapy in it as we write down by name parents, siblings, relations, friends, those who have died, and maybe people during the year. So just recalling them by name, I think, is a very interesting therapy. The November month begins with two important feast days, the Feast of All Saints and the Feast of All Souls, and it's a very much part of our tradition. And I think certainly the month of November, All Saints, is a very joyful start, remembering all the anonymous saints of the world. And secondly, I suppose the All Souls, and certainly older people remember maybe going to the number of masses being on the morning of the 2nd November. So again, very much part of our tradition and culture. And lastly, I suppose in that November brings us face to face with our own mortality. We think of people we have known and loved who have died. Maybe the generation before us is gone, and now we think, God, you know, where have the years gone? We're getting old ourselves, and just thinking about what are the important things of life maybe that have passed us by. So again, a chance to rethink our own mortality. Okay. As I said, November is very much focused on remembering our faithful departed, and that has a long history in the church. In fact, if you go back to Old Testament times, we're reminded that it's a wholesome thing to pray for the dead. So that notion of praying for the dead has been there over many, many centuries and many, many generations. Remembering the dead is very much part of our shared faith. It's not just something we do on our own, which obviously is personal to us, but it's part of our shared faith because we're there together during the month of November, mindful of those who've died, mindful of those who've been left behind, mindful of the November masses, maybe blessings in the graveyard. So it's very much part of all of that shared faith. And it's also part of our culture. As I said, even that consciousness of people maybe giving up luxuries, almost the flavor of Lent, the sweets, the alcohol that they give up for the month of November. And even still, clubs and organizations like to remember the deceased club members or benefactors, whoever it was. So again, it's very much part of our culture for the month of November. I came across a lovely phrase lately, which to me captures what November is all about. It says, "Into the cloak of my life is woven all the affection and tenderness of the people who are no longer here and whom I remember." That into the cloak of my life is woven all the affection and tenderness of the people who are no longer here and whom I remember. So we think particularly of those who have maybe shaped our lives and touched our lives, and maybe that we have known and loved are gone before us, but whom we still remember. I've looked at it maybe just, and I'm going to give you a background to an understanding of the different aspects of November, and then Francis is going to take you through some of the resources. Now, some of this is obviously fairly obvious to you, but maybe just to explore it a small bit more than you might be familiar with. So the first part of November is remembering and praying for our dead. And that sounds like a very obvious thing to do. But it says there, first of all, we remember our faithful departed, as I said before, maybe writing the November list, and also the annual masses in remembering our dead. Secondly, we remember those who have died since November of last year. And that has been very much part of the practice in our parishes, certainly over the last 20 or 30 years, as we remember especially those who died since November of last year. And they can be names remembered on a book of remembrance, or posters, or on a special book. Again, parishes have their own way of doing all of that. And thirdly, especially since March 2020 and the restrictions and COVID times since then, we're conscious of those who have died in that 18 months. Maybe people who died in a hospital on their own, the family weren't allowed in to see them, and funerals restricted to 10 or maybe 25 people. So we're very much conscious of those people, especially in this month of November. Secondly, it's not just about remembering the dead, but it's also about caring for the living. And I suppose the first point there, it says about praying for the bereaved. And I suppose it's praying especially for those who've been left behind. They've lost a loved one, a parent, a child, a neighbor, a friend, and maybe feeling that sense of loss. So our prayer is a sense of caring for the bereaved. And secondly, I suppose there's a sense of solidarity in all of that. And I suppose it's really saying that while life has moved on, and you still feel that sense of loss, that you're not on your own and that you haven't been forgotten. So I think that sense of solidarity is very important. Thirdly, I suppose, when people are bereaved, maybe they're mindful that people are praying for them, but there are other ways that we can offer that tangible and practical support, like a visit, writing a card or letter, or a phone call. And I think that they're the practical things that I think that we're often very good with, especially around the time of funeral, but maybe as life goes on, we forget a bit. So maybe November is a chance to invite people to do some of those practical things, to visit people who've been bereaved over the last year and a half, maybe to write a note to somebody you couldn't attend their funeral, or to pick up the phone and simply have a chat. And lastly, again, for those who've lost a family member or a relative during COVID times, they've had a very difficult 18 months without the usual supports. They hadn't the normal funeral that we would expect. They had the normal sympathizing of family, neighbors and friends. And even beyond that, when the funeral is all over and life goes on, the social calls of people who care for them simply weren't possible, especially during the various lockdowns. So it is a time of great isolation for many of those who are bereaved. So let us be mindful of those, especially in this month of November. The third practical point I mentioned is about visiting and tending the graves. Now, you know from your own experience that some people are great at visiting graves, and some people, it just does nothing for them. And I suppose that's part of human nature. The blessing of the graves is something that has really taken on over the last 10 years or more. Maybe parishes designating a particular afternoon, maybe a Sunday, inviting people to stand at their graves and the blessing of the graves, especially on a day in November. But it's also time maybe to clean up the graves. You know, in the summertime, people brought plants and pots and wreaths for different reasons, and they can be left over many weeks and months and looking shabby and disheveled. So November is a chance to pull the weeds, get rid of the old wreaths, maybe make necessary repairs, maybe tending to family graves or to graves of neighbours who've no one belonged to them and the family are scattered. Just a simple cleaning up of their graves is a charitable act for them. And lastly, and I think most importantly, November should be about celebrating our faith in the resurrection. And that's most important, because I say there at the start that November can sometimes be presented in a very morbid and sorrowful way. Yes, it's about mourning. Yes, it is about loss. But sometimes we can almost go further down into that loss and sorrowful feeling. So let us be mindful as we acknowledge the loss, acknowledge the sorrowfulness, the sorrowful feelings, but also it's like celebrating our faith. As I said there, sometimes November can have that almost Calvary feeling, that we wallow in the grief, we wallow in the sorrow, and yet we're an Easter people. We celebrate the empty tomb. And I really love that Easter Sunday gospel. Why look among the dead for someone who's alive? He is not here, he is risen. And I think, as I said, those 7 words have changed the meaning of life forever. He is not here, he is risen. And that really is what carries us in all of this, the hope of the resurrection. So while we acknowledge the sadness and the loss, we also celebrate the hope of the resurrection. And to me, there are 2 sides of the same coin. The sadness and the loss on one side, the hope of the resurrection on the other side. And finally, when we think about the resurrection, we think about the resurrection that really gives us a new vision and new strength as well. The vision that there is life beyond the grave, and the strength when our hearts are heavy and life is tough, but maybe gives us new strength to try to deal with our grief, to overcome our sorrow, and to maybe live life with that sense of hope and that sense of consolation as well. So now back to Francis, so gives an insight into some of the resources.
Thanks a million, Patrick. That was great. And I'm going to start almost where you concluded, in terms of I find that sometimes November we're so focused on the dead we might forget the living. And I found this lovely quote: "In the evening of life we will be judged on love alone." And I think there's an invitation in the Gospels of November's Sundays to reflect on how we are living life ourselves. Where is love in our lives? How are we reflecting the invitation of Christ to be his hands and feet? So I loved your suggestion there of stretching out to the neighbor, of maybe clearing up a grave for somebody else, doing things that are practical and real. So just in terms of, very quickly, in terms of resources, there's 3 sets of resources. So one I'm thinking of is that the very last Sunday in our church's year, which is the Feast of Christ the King, and it marries those 2 things that you mentioned there, Padraig, the cross, the death, and the resurrection, the kingship of Christ. That might be a great Sunday to renew the commissioning of our ministers. The gospel on that Sunday, it's different every year, but it's a great gospel because it invites us to reflect on who is Christ for us. And Christ is, of course, the servant king, the one who is available to others. So it might be an invitation for us to renew our ministers, and those of us who are ministers to come back and be energized in our ministry again. We will be sending out a resource to help you support, to pray with all those who died over the last 18 months. As Paul had mentioned, we haven't been able to be at funerals. So how do we support and kind of nurture and acknowledge our care for that community? Resources in terms of praying for all our departed loved ones, and a resource for you in terms of blessing of graves. For those who are bereaved, there's a collection of prayers and reflections, and these could be used by you on your parish website, on your parish newsletter. They could be used as a reflection after communion if they're appropriate. So just, I suppose, aware that there's people carrying loss in our midst. And I'm always very conscious, and Padraig and I spoke about it earlier today, that in the first year, we can be very, very conscious of people who've lost somebody. But sometimes it's year 2 or year 3 or year 13 or year 24 that can be equally difficult for somebody. So it's just, I suppose, that awareness that there can be loss and grief in people's hearts that we don't know of. Finally, I suppose we're suggesting that during the month of November, we might renew all the ministry groups in our parish. And by renewal, I suppose what we're suggesting is that we will have webinars, and we'll have one each Thursday looking at a different cohort and supporting a different group in our parish. So the first one on the 4th of November, Dr. Finola Canaan will speak with us about living with grief and bereavement. And even if we haven't lost somebody of our own loved ones or somebody that we're not conscious of, we've all lived with grief over the last year. And I see just a question somebody asked about even just the grief of when our churches were closed. So grief is part of living, isn't it? And how do we deal with it? So that's Dr. Finola Canaan on the 4th of November. On the 11th of November, we will work with the ministers of the Eucharist, and it'll be a time just of renewal, reflection on what their ministry gives, hopefully to themselves and to us as a community. On the 18th, Jane Mellett, who might be known to some of you, she is working with Trócaire in terms of Laudato Si. She's also the author of a new book with Trina Doherty on the Gospels for next year. She's going to explore the Word and the importance of the Word for us. And then finally, Dr. Jessie Rogers is going to work with us in terms of the Children's Liturgy of the Word, how we might do it. And for anybody who's working with children, that'll be a lovely evening. So there are ways of us renewing ourselves so that we really can be the hands and feet of Christ today. So maybe, Padraig, we'll see, does Tomás have any questions for us?
Yes, well, there's a few questions and comments, really.
Great.
I'll just read them out here, just bear with me. So the first one was, before we move forward and gather again, do you think we might need to address the malaise caused by the closure of our churches? That was the first question.
Do you want to take that, Padraig, or?
Yeah, I suppose it is difficult. I suppose there are many reasons we talk about malaise. Maybe for some people, it's the uncertainty of going back into crowded situations. Other people get out of the habit. So I suppose I'm not too sure how you could go back and address it, but I think we are where we are after 18 months of something that we never foresaw. And I think it's really trying to give people, I think the biggest challenge will be giving people the confidence of coming back, that it is a place of welcome, it is a safe place. And I suppose it's just be mindful that everybody isn't going to come back on the same day. But I think if people get that, if the word is out that it is good to be back, it is okay to be back, we want you back, we miss you, and that it's a safe place to be, I think that's the greatest reassurance we can give people.
And I think you're right, Padraig, in terms of, I think it's about gathering our energies now to move forward. And you'll see on the poster that we have for the Together Again season, as we're calling it, it's moving forward in hope. We're a Christian people, we're a resurrection people. So all we can do is hold the hope that is deep within us and give witness to that. And it'll be bit by bit. So each time that we sort of stretch our wings, we'll be stretching out a little bit further as a community.
And I suppose just one last point is that there is no doubting there are people who won't come back. But equally so, all our routines have been upset, and there are shops that we haven't gone back to in 18 months because we didn't like the shop, just too small, or we changed our routine for walking or driving. And so it has changed all of our habits. So there were people who will be lost, but let us present in a very positive way of a place of welcome and safety.
The other thing that strikes me is, yes, there might be people who don't feel okay about coming back, but we mustn't forget that we actually now have online communities, and we need to make sure that as we celebrate, that we also acknowledge those people. They might be people down the road who just at the moment are not feeling quite safe, but they might also be people who are abroad. And we've always had it that people have been joining us for a particular funeral or a particular wedding or etc. Isn't it lovely that we can still have that openness to a wider community? Any other questions, Padraig or Tomas?
Yes, just a point really, or a comment made, how the ushers and stewards, they should be introduced as a new ministry, a ministry of hospitality, and how it was great to feel welcomed when one arrived at the church, because that's something we're not used to. So I think you mentioned that already, Francis, that came across strongly there.
Brilliant, brilliant, yeah. And I think I've only heard positive about the ushers from both people coming to church and from clergy and other ministers. Would that be your experience, Padraig?
Yeah, very, very much so, certainly. And I suppose it is a chance for parishes to look again and say, is there a place for ushers in the future? And I think they certainly played a very important role, both in being safe and in counting the numbers, but also helping people to feel welcome and coming back.
I'm just conscious of time, Tomas. Is there a burning question?
Just one more in relation to altar servers. As some of them may not have been vaccinated yet, what's the recommendation, or is there any recommendation there yet?
There hasn't been a formal recommendation, but at the moment they haven't been brought back because we were limiting the number of ministries. So we'll just wait and see what October the 22nd says, and we'll see if there's anything more come that might give us more indication.
And one last comment, Francis, which I just on something you said there towards the end, resources for the recommissioning of ministers for Christ the King will be very welcomed. If there was a service or something that you could put into place for that, it'll be very welcomed.
Brilliant. Okay, that'll be sent out later on in the week.
And just one last point there, Tomas, or 2 points just before we conclude. When we talk about November, and very much the focus is on those who died during the year, very much parishes go parish by parish, and maybe just to be mindful of people who die outside of the parish and how do we include them because their relatives are living in the parish. So it's somebody living here in Tralee whose mother or father died in Dublin during the year, and just because they didn't die here or live here, that just means that there's not grief for them. So how do we include those people in the November Mass? And the second part is that liturgically, November runs into Advent. And I suppose just be mindful that the remembering of November ends when Advent begins, that there is no overlap. So it makes no sense in the world that we have the first Sunday of Advent this year on the 28th of November, if a parish was having November Mass on the 29th and the 30th, because we're crisscrossing liturgical seasons that make no sense. So November remembering goes up to Advent, and then it stops and Advent begins. So
actually, that's a really good one, Padraig, because sometimes there's a clash even when you're at Mass. If you've had Advent one day and then we're back to November the next day, it just doesn't make sense within ourselves. Yeah, thank you. I think we might leave it there, Tomas. Would that be okay?
That's great. Yeah, that's great. And any more questions, we can address them and we'll get back to people again.
Yeah.
So just to say thank you so much to Francis and to Pádraig for your excellent presentations. And I'd also like to thank Father Ger Godley for his work with the IT and technology in the background. So thank you so much, Ger, for keeping everything going there. And thank you to you all for being with us here this evening online. And we greatly look forward to being able to meet very soon again, face to face. So in the meantime, stay safe. And I hope you can all look forward now to being together again. So thank you so much and good night.